Hey friends, today this video is going to be about old cell phones and some old tablets. And this whole thing comes about because I opened a cupboard thinking I was going to clean it out. And as I went along, I discovered more and more of these old devices and thought this might make kind of a cool video. So that's how we end up here. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. So we're going to start with this guy. I don't believe this is literally the first cell phone we had, but it's certainly of the same type as the first cell phone we had. This is a Motorola. Motorola called it the digital personal communicator. So this is about 1991 or 1992. And this device and this generation of cell phones was significant because it really began to open the door for making cell phones available to a wider audience, heading down the path towards today where almost everyone has a cell phone these days. And some of those factors that made that occur were, despite the fact that this thing is quite a brick, it's pretty heavy, it's pretty large, it would be considered small, light, and portable by its day. So you could carry this thing around, and it was light and small enough to carry it. You often had a little holster for it, some people did, or you would just cram that big old thing in your pocket. And so the way you use this thing, before I go there, I wanted to finish the other aspects of it. So that was one thing, size and portability. Another factor that made it begin to open the door to more people was it was practical to use, so it had enough battery life to be usable. And then the third factor was the cost. And the way you use this thing is you pop it open like that, and then you pull up this antenna, and that's how you place a call. This thing had no texting. Texting didn't exist at this time, but you could place a call and you could receive calls on this device. And I think they advertised battery time of 2-hour talk time and maybe 10 or 12 hours standby. In real life it might be less than that, but it was still enough that you could take this phone with you, leave the house, and have access, have connectivity, have mobility, and ability to make phone calls outside the house. And speaking of the price issue, though, I don't remember all the details on this phone and what it cost, but I remember one of those sort of marker lines was kind of a game-changing thing, was that this phone was $1 a minute to make a phone call. So 1 minute phone call would cost you $1, 5-minute phone call would cost $5. And yeah, that's pretty expensive, but by the standard of the time, that opened up mobile phones to a much wider audience where you could start thinking about, I could maybe afford one of these. And so that was that first generation that we had in our household, a phone like this. I'm going to move forward now a fair bit, but it still shows the evolution of cell phones over that period. So the trends were, at this time, smaller, lighter, longer battery life. And that's really what you see in this evolution from this phone to this phone. And they're both Motorola's. This is a Motorola and this is a Motorola. Motorola is a company that was out of Chicago at the time, and they have an interesting history. But that was kind of the evolution we saw in these phones. These are both, I guess you could say, flip phones. And flip phones weren't the only kind of phones from this period, but it was certainly one of the more common ones, or more popular types of cell phones. And this phone is from the late 90s. So this is this evolution that we see over that period, from the early 90s, the first cell phones, to late 90s, and that trend towards smaller, lighter, and longer battery life. And along those same trends, this is another style of phone from a similar era. This phone is a little, they're close. This phone is maybe 2000 or so. And I wanted to talk about I wanted to show this sample because it was another popular brand. In fact, one of the most popular. And these phones, this is a Nokia brand, and these phones, and they had a number of phones in a similar style to this, as well as other phones, but some of these were really, this style was some of the most common. And they were well known they had a reputation for being very durable. You could be pretty harsh with these things, and they would survive it. And they also had very long battery life. So if we talk about this guy, this first phone that had a couple hours talk time and 10 or 12 hours standby, and this newer Motorola was probably 3 or 4 days on a charge that you could use that phone before you had to charge it again. These Nokias, 10 days, maybe more on one battery charge. So that was another big factor about these phones. And you'll notice neither of these phones have cameras yet. Although towards this era and before we actually get into real smartphones, we started to see phones that still looked a lot like this, or even this, but they actually had a camera as well. And in those days they started to call those camera phones. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have a lot of other things, but they had camera phones. And also in this period is when text messaging began to become popular and widely used in the US. And so that's not until the early 2000s, because in the US we were slow to have text messaging work across networks. So people tended to not use it as much in the beginning, because even if this phone supported text messaging, this is an AT&T phone, and so I might only be able to talk to other people on AT&T, and that made it, you didn't know always that somebody was on AT&T. So if you did use text messaging in the very early days, it might be with a small circle of people that you know are on the same network. But once in the US we adopted text messaging across networks and carriers, so you could have T-Mobile or AT&T or Verizon, and you could text across those networks, then text messaging took off. And in these early days, but especially those 90 kids would remember this, that you texted on these things by multi-tap. So you could get pretty good at it, and people got pretty fast at it. But still, we tended to send pretty short messages because of that. And we also tended to use a lot of the same kind of abbreviations that many we still use today, like IDK for I don't know, or BRB for be right back. And so that was common with these phones as well as with instant messaging. But and certainly it was convenient to have those shorthands, because then you didn't have to enter as many characters. So now I'm going to branch off the cell phone road for a moment and talk a little bit about these early tablet type devices. And one of the first successful ones was a device like this. And this is not that first generation of these, but it's still very similar to the same type of device. But the very first ones were called Palm Pilots. And they were this little device, and they didn't call them a tablet back then. They called these a PDA, which I believe is Personal Data Assistant. You can check that in the comments if I got that wrong and let me know. But I believe that's what this would be called, was a PDA. And so this was late 90s. So I think these were 1997 when these came out. And one reason they were successful is because they limited the feature set down to things that you could do with this older, slow hardware. It didn't have that many capabilities, so they limited what you could do with it. So what Palm did, especially in the earliest models, is they focused on some of the most common things people wanted to do. And this example would be a calendar, a to-do list, and notes, or like memos. And this device has no connectivity, so it has no internet, no phone calls, nothing like that. So it has no connectivity. And you could think of it worked similar to how early iPods worked. If you used the first generations of iPods that didn't have connectivity, you don't have anything like a Spotify or Pandora or any way to download music once you're on the go. The way those early first iPods worked, we plugged them into our little dock, or we plugged them into our computer, I should say, and we synced up with our iTunes library. And so when we left, we took our iPod with us, it had the music it had. There was no way to add music on the road, on the go with that iPod. So we had to load up what we wanted to load and then take the iPod with us. And it just had that music, and it had nothing else. You couldn't add more songs until you went back to the computer and synced up with iTunes again. And this device worked in that same way. So it predates the iPod by a number of years, but it worked in that same way, where you would take this device, you would plug it into the computer, and it would sync up your calendar, your to-do list, your memos, and then you could take the device with you, and you'd have those items with you. So you had your calendar, your memos, and your notepad, or I should say your to-do list. And then you could use this device, use the stylus. You could make a new calendar appointment. You could add some notes. You could update your to-do list. And then when you got back to your computer again, plug it into the computer, and it would sync up. Now the new items would all be synced between your device and your PDA, your Palm Pilot. And so that's how this device worked, and it was successful because it limited those features to things that it could do pretty well. Other devices in this time era, companies had tried to make tablet devices or devices like tablets, but they just tried to make them do too much, and they were just unusable, and so they were basically market failures. But these devices were quite popular because they worked, and they gave people value. So at this time, this late 90s, when these devices a device like this has no connectivity, so you would carry around two devices, multiple devices, maybe this little guy, something like one of these cell phones to make phone calls and text, possibly. And then you carry something like this for your calendar and appointments and to-do lists and things like that. And then I'm going to look at one more tablet from a similar era. So we're right in that same roughly timeline. This is a little newer. So this device came out in 1999, and it's a Philips Nino. And so this is the third generation of these Philips Nino devices. And this one, it has a color screen. The earlier ones were like this Palm Pilot. They just had a monochrome screen, so no color. And this little device is basically trying to be a pocket computer. I think that was the language they used for this. So it was basically trying to be a little mini PC in a pocket device. And this particular model of this Philips device runs Windows CE, which is a version of Microsoft Windows that predates Windows Mobile. And so that was a version of a Windows operating system designed for these smaller devices. We're going to try to turn these guys on. They're 20-year-old devices. We're going to try to turn those on and see what happens. I'll do that later in the video if you stick around. So now I'm going to move on along this same timeline. So we've gone into early 90s, late 90s. Sort of right now we're heading into the early 2000s. And this is now text messaging is pretty common. And people are, of course, having the internet. Most people have the internet these days, or certainly a lot more people have the internet. And certainly people are text messaging, and people are having, almost everyone has mobile phones by now. So this is one of the first generation, or one of the early smartphone. And this again is the same maker. So this is Nokia on that little phone, and this is also Nokia. So this is one of the earliest smartphones, and what we saw here is a little bit larger screens. So we're getting slightly larger screens. This guy has a camera, and it had, if you wanted to pay for it, it had connectivity to the internet. So you could buy service to connect to the internet. It has this little joystick, and that would be one way you navigate. It has some other buttons for navigation as well. And it was quite limited because there weren't very many sites that you could use on a small device like this back in those days. Most sites were not set up for a small screen, and often it was a slow connection. It was very expensive. So it was difficult to use, but it had it. So this is one of the first attempts at a smartphone. So instead of carrying around two devices like you might do here, one for your connectivity and another for your sort of personal data assistant apps like calendar and so on, you now would have just this one device that could do both those things. And I didn't have to sync anymore. It had an online connection, so I could pull data down while I'm using it. I could update and sign into things and update them directly from the phone for the minimum number of things that supported that. So again, pretty early days, but that would be an example of an early smartphone. So this is about 2003. So we've gone to the early 2000s. So this predates the iPhone, but we started to see these beginning smartphones. Next I'll go to another smartphone that predates the iPhone, and this is another Nokia phone. And Nokia had several phones in this era, generation of their early smartphones before the iPhone. And we see some of the same features. It's got a pretty high quality camera for its day. This is about 2005 for this phone, and it has a 3 megapixel camera, which is quite a lot for the day. And it was a pretty expensive phone as well. And this phone also had internet connectivity if you wanted to pay for it. And again, you still suffered some of those same problems. There weren't very many sites that you could use from this little device in practice, but it did have that connectivity. And this one has a slide down keyboard. And so the way you would navigate it is it has kind of a little gamepad type navigation device and a couple of other buttons related to using those online tools. But again, you're still texting with the multi-tap. Although I think this one might have also brought up a soft keyboard. And also there was another technology that tried to do sort of predictive text and some other things. But the most common way of texting was that multi-tap way. Okay, now we're going to get to this guy, which is our first generation iPhone. So this literally isn't the first generation, but it's the same idea. It's pretty close. I think this is a 3G or something phone, but it's pretty much the same form factor. And this is what the original iPhone looked like. And so we're comparing it to these earlier smartphones, and then the iPhone. So this guy really set the stage for everything to come. So pretty much any phone we're using today looks like this now. It has this type of interface where it has touch, and it has pinch and zoom, and it has swipe. So pretty much any cell phone you're using, even if it doesn't say iPhone anymore, it may be an iPhone, but even if it's not an iPhone, it probably has those same features that this phone introduced. And so it really took all these basic functionalities that people were doing and put it in one place. If you went spec by spec, this high-end Nokia phone of roughly the same era might have had better spec by spec numbers. So the camera was probably higher quality. It might have faster processor. It might have more memory. It might have a number of things that the iPhone didn't have. But what the iPhone did have was an easy-to-use interface that ordinary folks could figure out how to use. So you could use that camera in multiple ways. You could do text messaging. You could do email. You could browse the internet in a much more effective way. And that's what they got right. In some sense, they kind of took a page from this old Palm Pilot's book. When Palm Pilot decided to leave features out to make this device practical and usable, rather than try to put in too much and it didn't really work and it frustrated people, they got a few things that it did well and made them work easy to use. And the iPhone did the same thing. The original iPhone, Apple left features out of this phone intentionally because they wanted to focus on what could be done in this platform and in this form factor by ordinary people. So you may not remember or may not know that the first iPhone had no App Store. The App Store came later. So these first iPhones came with what they came with, and that was it. You didn't have an App Store and you couldn't download apps. But what they did put in it is they made it work well. So they took out things, and you could say that's less features, and some people complained about that. In fact, some features took a long time for Apple to finally introduce. But what they got right was that basic set of features people wanted, and it was easy enough to use that ordinary folks could take this iPhone and use it and get value out of it right away. And that's why pretty much that phone displaced all these other phones. And then from there forward, pretty much every phone has copied this phone to this day. And what an amazing transition from this first guy, early 90s. You could place a phone call, that's it, no texting, nothing else. Battery lasted a few hours, and it was $1 a minute to make a call, all the way to this guy that now we just assume, we just take for granted this idea of placing a call from anywhere and getting all that connectivity from pretty much anywhere. And so that's what an amazing journey from that first phone of some 30 years ago to today. And a few things, when people were using this phone, we would often hear the language, a couple of things you never hear anymore, even though some things never change. You would hear, call me when you get to a landline, because the quality on these things was always sketchy and often garbled, and you dropped calls. But, as I say, some things never change. We still complain about dropped calls all these years later. Okay, so let's go ahead and play with these guys and see what happens if we try to turn them on. So I'm going to pop a battery into this old Palm Pilot and see what happens. Okay, I saw it said, okay, there we go. So what it's saying is remove the stylus. And you can see the high-tech graphics that this thing has. Remove the stylus and tap anywhere to continue. So that's what I'll do. And now it's going to have me calibrate by touching these little targets. So again, it says step 2 of 4. Use the stylus to tap anywhere to continue. So I'll do that. And again, I'm gonna tap these little targets. Tap there. Tap there. Tap there. This would be a one-time setup. You didn't have to do this every time you turned it on. That one's to set the date, and look, the starting date is year 2000. So we'll go up a little bit farther. Maybe we can get all the way to 2022. What do you think? Let's see if it'll go there. Look at that. 2022, March 22. Go. And now it's asking me about this web clipping thing. So I talked about how this device didn't have any connectivity, but it would sync with your computer. So this web clipping functionality was, I never used it, to be honest with you. I just did calendar and notes and to-do lists on this device, but the idea of it was you could clip web pages, I guess, and take them with you. So that's what that's about. And now we're done with the setup. So now you get to see what this interface on this thing looks like. So we also get a little time capsule of what was happening in this era in the world. And we've got an example of that would be Ask Jeeves there. So anyone remember that thing? So Ask Jeeves was kind of a before Google thing. We've got MapQuest again. That's an app that people used to print maps back in the day, and that's on here. And Travelocity. So some of these companies still exist. Some of them aren't too popular or don't exist anymore. But you can see kind of a snapshot of the world. Movie Phone was a really cool service that you could use to find movie times in your area. And I'll just show how this worked for entering data. So it had its own way of strokes to create of handwriting. You had to learn how to do it. It's been 20 years, so I don't really remember exactly how it worked, but we're going to try it, and I can show how that worked to enter data, to enter text. But once you got good at it, you could enter a lot. I entered many paragraphs, many pages of text into this device back in the day. So we can see here. Let's try this. If I can remember some of these strokes. So let's try. Yeah, there's A, M, S, R. Oh, I got one too many characters. It picked up one of those strokes as an extra letter. But you can kind of see the idea of how that works. I think you can swipe like that to back up. And now I have it. And you can see it says, maybe you can see, maybe you can't, but it says A. Oh, I get AMSR. How about that? Let's back up again. Got that backwards. A, S, M, R. And that worked. So you can see that's how you'd enter text. And as I said, once you got good at it, you could actually use that pretty effectively. So that's that little guy. And you can see the kind of what technology looked like back in the day, back in this day. Let's try to turn this other guy on. I can't turn him off. Oh, there he goes. Okay, now we can see if we can turn this other guy on. This is this Philips Nino. So it was touted as a portable computer. So let's see if it'll come on. It's not coming on. Oh, there it goes. Okay, so there you can see that screen. It's a color screen. Makes the little beepy sound. And it wants me to press the action button, which I think is this button. And now it's going to go through something similar to calibrate the screen. So we tap there, tap there, tap there, tap there, and one more time, tap there. Now says I can press that action button again. Just that guy, I think. Yeah, that's right. And again, it wants me to set the date here. I'm just going to skip that and go to the main screen. So we're not going to worry about the date and time right now. So it says my setup is complete, so it says tab. And there you have the hourglass spinning, just like we still have today. And you can see this is what this Windows CE interface looks like. It has a start menu, so you've got several items on there. Calendar, contacts, inbox, a note taker, task list, and even a voice recorder, because this thing does have a microphone and a speaker. You got this programs menu, and you can see some of the apps that were available on this guy. And we'll go into solitaire. I had some games. You can see how that worked. It's got a virtual keyboard. You can enter text. And then you've got, like these guys, you can drag these around. So you get the idea. Okay, well, there we go. That's what this technology, 1999 is when this device came out. Put that away. We'll turn it off. Maybe we'll turn it off. It's not turning off. Oh, maybe I have to use the stylus. Yeah, I don't know. It's not turning off, but that's okay. We'll worry about that later. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So there it is. That's that device. 20 years old. Maybe a little bit more than that. 20 something years old. Let me turn that on. Got that to work. So I hope that you enjoyed that little path down memory lane, showing some old cell phones and some old tablets. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.